I absolutely love building things for my kids, and toys and games are fun, but what I'm really looking forward to is them getting old enough to appreciate furniture. Now, my son is 7 years old. He's been asking me for a bunk bed for a while now, so this was a long overdue project, but here it is. So there's a twin size bed at the top. At the bottom, we have a full size bed inserted perpendicular to the twin. Three shelves here for storage of just fun stuff, books, which is nice and convenient when I read to him at night. On this side, instead of a ladder, I actually used multiple rails between the legs, and those are serving as rungs of a ladder. And on this side, the best part is the slide. My son absolutely loves this thing. So it's a lot of material to make a project like this. I used Alder, went to our local supplier, Austin Hardwoods, and got a bunch of 8/4 Alder. And it's a pretty big project, and it's going to be a long video, so sit tight. The bed requires a lot of wood. Thankfully, the wood in my son's room is alder, and alder is pretty cheap. I'll start by milling the stock for the legs. You know, people told me that I'd regret downgrading to a non-slider when cutting wide pieces, but honestly, they're full of it. There's absolutely no disadvantage to this setup. As an alternative, I can always cut down large stock with my jigsaw. Since the boards are rough, I'll rip them down at the bandsaw and then mill them to thickness and width using the jointer and planer. Alder is pretty knotty, so I'll put the worst knots on the inside of the joints and hide them. Because alder is pretty soft, you'll see me using scrap material to protect the wood whenever possible. Any exposed knots are filled with epoxy. The epoxy stabilizes them and also fills them so that they look like sap. Once the glue is dry, the legs are milled to final dimension. There are actually 5 legs in this project. The 5th leg acts as a support for the slide. Hey, check out those planer brackets! The legs are then cut to final length at the chop saw. Next, I'll begin cutting the stock for the front and side rails. Now back to the legs. I'll lay out my mortises carefully using a story stick. The front and rear rails need to be detachable, so I'll not only make mortises for dominoes, but also knock down connectors. With a shim that accounts for the offset, I can use the same story stick on the ends of the rails. A lot of people wonder at what point it makes more sense to get the Domino XL over the 500. Well, if you're making a lot of stuff on the scale of this bed, you'll definitely want the XL. The rails get an additional hole in the face for the connector hardware. Because my tenons would collide inside the leg, I miter the ends so that I can get as much depth as possible. Boop. I like to glue the tenons in ahead of the final assembly just to have one less thing to worry about later. The short rails receive 3 tenons, and the center one doesn't need to be mitered. This is because the adjoining rail will have a connector bolt in that location, and they don't go as deep. On the leg side, I can insert this little threaded do-jobber thingy for the connector. I thought this would be a good time for a test fit. And what do I find? I accidentally put mortises at the top of the rear legs. I find that tapping my foot and pointing at the mistake repeatedly helps prevent throwing things around the shop. This is where we have the opening to the top bunk, so there's no need for mortises. I'll either have to patch the holes or come up with another idea later. For now, I'll start to drop in the half rail so that I could work out the rest of the details for the sides. By the way, at this stage of the process, I don't have a fully worked out plan. Many of the measurements are coming directly from the project itself as I build, such as the vertical posts that support the half rail. Now let's work on the slats. I have so many 8/4 scraps at this point that it just makes sense to resaw the offcuts to get the 3/4 inch material that I need. To get the final length of these slats, I pop the top and bottom rails into my legs and get the measurement directly from the project. That's the fit we're looking for. I decided on the layout and spacing that I like and marked the lines for the domino joints. 2 per slat should do the trick. Don't be too concerned about the wide spacing of these slats. The bed itself will cover them, so I'm not worried about stuck heads. But if it concerns you, just add more slats. This is a good time to glue in the tenons. At this point, I was feeling a little uninspired by the design. The bed would be fine in a boring, vanilla sort of way, but I felt it needed a little bit of a boost in the style category. Because, what self-respecting 7-year-old would sleep in a bland bunk bed? So I decided to jazz up the slats in the most overcomplicated way possible by adding a slight curve on both edges. I'll also scoop out some material from the edge toward the center. The first cuts are at the bandsaw with the table tilted slightly. I'll clean up that surface at the spindle sander. Now I'll cut the curve in the edge. The rest of the work is done by hand, smoothing all surfaces and blending them into one another. I was feeling pretty good about this decision until I realized I had 11 more to do. Oy. Now I'll go back to my sides and lay out the joinery for the half rail and support post. With the slats done, it's a little easier to be confident in the placement of all the parts. To lighten the appearance of the lower rails while also creating a little bit more headroom, I'll add curves to the bottom edges. The short rails are easy to lay out using a drawing bow. This is one I picked up from Lee Valley. The long ones require a little bit more work. Using a long piece of scrap and a couple of blocks clamped at an angle, I can bend the strip to the desired curve and draw it on the board. A good way to fare a big curve like this is with a rasp. Held at an angle, the back and forth motion will knock down all of the high spots. A pencil line is great for gauging your progress. The curve already looks good, but this refining process is all about the feel. You shouldn't feel any unexpected hills or valleys. The final treatment is sanding with a flexible sanding strip. Next, I'll lay out the ladder rails with spacing that makes sense for my son's size. If your child is a little bit younger, consider adding a 4th rail. I've had enough time to sulk about those misplaced mortises, and I'm glad I didn't fix them yet, because I just realized they'd make a great place for handholds. I shaped the handhold so that it's a little bit easier for a small hand to grip. Let's call that a happy accident. Time for a few sub-assemblies. First, the rails get a nice large decorative chamfer. It's super important to keep the orientation of your parts straight, otherwise you might have your slats facing the wrong way. The side rail is a bit tricky, so use a glue that gives you the time that you need to put the parts together. After the glue dries, I'll clean up the faces with some sanding and finish off the chamfers with a chisel where appropriate. I'll also take the time to ease all of the edges to avoid any pointy stuff. With the side rail subassembly together, I can attach the legs. It's projects like this that make me wish I had a shop helper. The handle gets glued in place and the rest of the connector hardware is screwed in. This is the side that gets the shelves, so I'll start working on the supports. Each shelf requires 2 shelf supports that'll be screwed into the legs. A simple rectangle would do the trick, but I'll add a nice little taper to the underside as well as some chamfers. Each one is pre-drilled and countersunk for screws. I'll use a tapered plug cutter to cut a bunch of snug-fitting plugs. The supports are then carefully positioned and screwed directly to the leg. The plugs are then glued on top of the screws. Once trimmed flush and sanded, they pretty much disappear. Before gluing the other side together, I'll add some large roundovers to the ladder rails. I won't lie, this particular glue up was stressful. Lots of mortise and tenon joints, but I'm using Titebond Extend, which gives me a little bit more working time. Thankfully, no major issues, though the battery died during the glue up. And guess what I wasn't willing to do right in the middle of a tense part of the project? Change the battery. So here's the finished assembly. The twin bed is supported by slats that rest on cleats. Those cleats are glued and screwed to the inside of the front and rear rails. I'll counterbore and attach with screws. From here on out, I'll be making decisions using the partially assembled bed frame. My shop isn't small by any means, but working around this thing for a few weeks really sucked. And really, there's no way around it. Putting this thing together is a 2-person job. Nicole's sweet lady muscles were up to the task. Now I'll mill up some maple boards for the slats. I'm actually just going with random widths here. Each one gets a countersunk hole for attachment to the rail cleats later. Now for the slide. The 2 side rails each receive a long groove for the slide surface. With the rail in place, I can support the bottom at the desired angle, which is about 30 degrees, and lay out for the notch at the top. The notch is then cut by hand. The top of the rail needs to be cut at a 30-degree angle so that it sits flush with the back of the leg. With the slide rail back in place, I clamp the vertical support stock to the rail and mark out the locations of the half laps. Back at the bench, I scribe the lines with a knife. Not only is it more accurate using a knife, but it also helps prevent tear out. With the dado stack at the table saw, I run a few test cuts until the 2 pieces come together perfectly flush. Now I can cut the joint on the supports and the rails. The supports are pretty easy because they're short, but the rails are a bit more of a task. Outboard support is absolutely critical. The joint should go together pretty easily with some light taps. A half-lap joint has so much long-grain glue surface that it's incredibly strong, and it doesn't really need any additional reinforcement. The ends of the rails are a bit sharp and could use a little bit of shaping for safety and for looks. With both rails in place, I'll measure for the slide stock. I'm using 3/4 inch plywood. The ply is then dressed up with some solid stock at the ends. I like to flush it up with a block plane and then finish it off with some sanding. My plywood is actually slightly cupped, which makes setting it into this long groove incredibly tricky, so I'm going to use a long set epoxy for the glue up. Lucky for me, my neighbor Jim just returned some Tupperware while the glue up was happening, so I put him to work. Even with 2 people, the glue up was still stressful. If you don't have a neighbor Jim, I highly recommend getting one. They're so choice. With a block plane, I'll shape the overhanging edge. Now let's make the shelves. These are just simple plywood shelves with solid wood trim on all sides. The front piece of trim is 1.5 inches wide to provide additional support and to make the shelf look thicker. The shelves get a nice chamfer and they simply drop on top of the supports. Screws can be driven up through the supports later. And there it is, all beautiful and in my way. Now for the finish. I need this wood to match the existing wood in my son's room, which is a brown stained alder. I also want the finish to have no VOCs, so I'm giving Rubio Monocoat a try. I'm using their walnut tinted oil. With so much surface area to cover, I found it easiest to use an applicator on my random orbit sander followed by a terry cloth buffer. I'm using very small amounts of oil here because I don't want the alder to blotch too much. It's gonna blotch, and I actually want it to, but not excessively. Anywhere the sander can't reach is done by hand. Even though I'm using this product on the bed, do not take this as an endorsement. I'm actually using it specifically because I want to see how it holds up over time so that I could better field questions about it. The product is expensive, so I need to determine for myself if it warrants the hype. So far, so good. Because the slide will receive a lot of wear, I'm actually going to top coat it with tabletop epoxy. I've never used this stuff before, but I figured it would be fun to experiment with. The first coat is basically a seal coat. I also realize at this point that my shop is a little bit too cold since the epoxy isn't quite flowing as well as I'd like. The heat gun not only helps with the bubbles, but also warms this stuff up. Once the first coat is dry, I sand it back, wipe it clean, and then apply a final coat. This time I warmed the epoxy and put the shop heaters on high, and the stuff flowed much better. Once cured, I sanded the surface with 1000 grit. I then applied an extremely light layer of Rubio to get rid of the haze, followed by a nice coat of wax. And yes, my ultimate goal here is to shoot my children off of this thing like a rocket. And finally, the big install. To make my life easier carrying this stuff up the stairs, I decided to glue the slide support leg into the frame on location. By the way, I do plan to add some bolts connecting the slide rail directly to the legs. And of course, I had to sneak in a quick slide before the big reveal.